This is chapter 1, verse 40. A man with leprosy came and knelt in front of Jesus, begging to be healed. "If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean," he said. Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched him. "I am willing," he said. "Be healed." Instantly, the leprosy disappeared and the man was healed. Then Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. "Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed." But the man went and spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. As a result, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter a town anywhere, and he had to stay out in secluded places, but people from everywhere kept coming to him. All right, this actually is a fairly remarkable moment. The first words, the last words in the section right above it, and remember, verses and chapters are not real. You guys know that, right? That they were added, 13th and 16th century or something. I'll get the exact dates if you want them. But the chapters, those divisions are all just weird. And the last two words of the chapter, or the section right before, was exorcising demons. And then the next words, and in the Greek it would just be jammed up against each other, and then it goes, "and comes." By the way, just as you're reading this book on your own, just mark every time that you find a word came, come, anything like that, because this is like the driving force, because what's happening almost all the time is somebody is coming to Jesus. And this is somewhat the narrative undercurrent of the whole book. But when it says "and comes" in the Greek, but who comes is a surprise for multiple reasons. Just the raw Greek is "and comes to him a leper." Now, I'm just going to say this was about as an unexpected coming as could have been imagined in their world. I'm sure you've heard people preach on lepers in this first century before, but we're going to have to stop a minute and explain why this encounter was so unexpected and why it is so important. And we just have to start by talking about leprosy, okay? And I feel with this, like, I did enough looking that I found out that what I have going on with my face because of the doctor would not count me as a leper. So I'm happy about that. We're not going to go into great detail about leprosy, but I will say this, that leprosy was a term, and guess what the Greek word for leprosy is? Leprosy, yeah, it's the same. Yeah, it's almost exactly the same. It's a little different, but it's a term that included all kinds of skin diseases and afflictions. And we have a disease now that we call leprosy, and it has the common name is Hansen's disease, and it is not thought, now the scholars debate this, but it's not thought that what we're talking about when we talk about leprosy in the Bible is the same as leprosy as we see it now. Am I ringing in the room, or is that just me? I'm ringing. Is Cindy up? Can we turn me down just a little bit? Oh, she's down here. Oh, you turn me up? I just feel like I'm ringing. Okay. You know, I don't think they care about that, because usually junior high and high school kids are in here, and they just let them, it's like so loud anyway that they don't care about the ringing. But anyway, but I'm at an age now where, like, any sound that's not supposed to be there, I think is going to hurt me in the future. So anyway, as I said, it's debated as to whether the leprosy that we have now, if you were to go to a leper colony in India or someplace like that, it would be a different disease. But all I want to say is that the term included all kinds of afflictions, and I don't need to go into all the details about it. But the point is that if you had one of these afflictions, one of these things, you were declared unclean. And unclean is not a medical term, it's a spiritual term. And so there is a deep connection between this disease and sin. And this is true for almost any kind of affliction that people would have in that world, but this is going to play out in this whole story that we're reading about. To have leprosy and to be declared unclean, that designation was horrible for a person. And it came with multiple rules. Now, we're not going to read them all, but just mark it down if you're taking notes that if you read chapters 13 and 14 of Leviticus, that's all they're about. It's all about how do they determine if you have leprosy. What do you have to do if you find out you have it? What do you do if you find out you get cured from it? And it's like tons of rules, and it's very complicated. We'll talk about some of it, but it's almost impossible for us to understand how destructive this diagnosis, if you will, by a priest would have been to somebody's lives. Lepers, by virtue of being declared unclean with this particular problem, there's no, like, you can get unclean, you could become unclean by touching a dead body or by bumping into. If you knew if a person with leprosy was sitting under a tree and you walked under the canopy of that tree, you were declared unclean as well. And then you'd have to go through all the cleansing things. I mean, you could do it if you didn't have the disease, or you could get clean back to being able to go to the temple and be in the community and touch your cooking pots and all that stuff. If you could get that way if you didn't have the disease, but once you were declared such, you had to move out of the community and live in someplace outside of the community. You had to wear your hair long and unkempt all the time. You had to, you had to wear torn up clothing. You had to cover up your face to here. I don't even know why, but I think it's probably because there's a connection between sin and demons and all this stuff, that if your mouth was not covered, it might come out and get on somebody. They didn't believe in germs, but they had to cover, they had to yell out, unclean, unclean, all the time, anywhere they went. And if somebody touched you, or anything you'd touched, they were unclean, and they'd have to go through a long process of getting themselves washed up and back to normal. Now, there's a huge connection in their minds between sin and getting leprosy. And the general thought was that I want to make sure it was slander, was it not? Yes. Most people thought that if you had leprosy, you had slandered somebody and not gotten caught or whatever, and God was going to punish you for being a slanderer, and so you got leprosy. Now, so think about this. Not only did a person who was declared to have leprosy thrown out of their community, thrown out of their family and their home, but they were also assumed to be great sinners, so much so that they got this terrible disease from God as a punishment. Now you're starting to get the picture? It's like rough. It's really terrible. And again, this wasn't a medical issue. It was purely a spiritual issue. Nothing in Leviticus ever talks about get a salve or talk to a doctor or something like, nothing like that. It's nothing like that. It's just, you're just on your own. And I'll just say this, that all of the offerings that are related to being healed of leprosy, because there's a bunch of stuff we'll talk about that more in a minute, but if you get healed from leprosy, and by the way, a person with leprosy was treated the same as a dead body. Also, there were two miracles that were equated as equal. Healing a person from leprosy, which meant they had to go to the priest and be declared healed, and raising the dead. They're in the same bucket. That's how unusual someone being healed from this disease was. So anyway, and again, it's just all kinds of afflictions. Now, if you read there's some really specific ways that they could tell that people had it or didn't have it, and it says if this is, it's all kinds of stuff. But it's, again, can you imagine if you guys started to get the sniffles and your first thing you had to do was come to me? And my dad's a doctor, and I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but I'm not a doctor. But my point is then I would go, well, we're pretty sure that people with the sniffles have been lusting. Tell me about it. But the truth is, in Jewish religion, they didn't have a thing called confession. The only way you got healed was through the system. Now, all of the sacrifices, if you did get healed, were all related to sin and thanksgiving for the forgiveness of sin. And so nobody, with a person with, the reason I'm hammering this and going on and on about leprosy and people who are lepers is important because the last person that anybody in the first century would have expected to come to Jesus is a leper. Why? Because he's breaking every rule about having leprosy that's possible. All of them. There is no possibility that lepers are going to come out into public and suddenly be in front of Jesus. Now it says that the Greek is interesting because it essentially says that he'd gotten his attention somehow before he kneels. And he kneels before him. And the word for kneeling, and it's interesting that some of the scholars are really strong on this, that the kind of word that is there means the kind of kneeling you only do before a king or God himself. Now, I'm just going to say that's the right word, okay? That's the right word because we're talking about him coming out of no place and kneeling before Jesus. And he would be right on both accounts, a king and God. But it says he begs, he calls towards him. It's an interesting phrase. He calls towards him, and he says this, let me get it. I just want to, oh gosh, when you get the notes, you'll think that I spent the whole last week studying leprosy. He calls towards him, and he says this thing that, it strikes us as odd. If you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Now, what it sounds like, he's saying, people talk about this, and what do you mean if you're willing? What do you mean if you're willing? And I just want to say that all Jews in prayer always were deferential to God when they prayed about something they wanted to be done. They always prayed in a way that's like they never assumed that God wanted to do anything. They would always say, if you're willing, if it's something that you would like to do, it's not a question of whether or not they think he can do it, or even that he wants to do it, but they would always speak to him this way. They always pray this way. Because why? Because they're trying to be careful. Remember, these are people who don't even say the name of God. They won't even say it or write it. And so when they're praying, they're being very careful. And so this man with leprosy, who has really shown how brave he is, and another thing he's shown is he is very confident that Jesus can do this, or he would, and he really wants to be healed, or he wouldn't do what he did, which was literally threaten everybody, because Jesus isn't by himself. Everybody is now in trouble. Now remember, if that leper is under the same tree canopy as you, you become unclean. And so now he's right here. He's right here. If you are willing, you can heal me. Now the word there for you can is dunamis, and we have this word everywhere in the New Testament. Dunamis is the word that is generally translated as power. Now I want to talk about this for a minute because this word it's all over the place, and it's going to be all over the place in this book, and we need to know what dunamis is. Dunamis means that within something or someone is the potential to bring great change. It means that resident within someone is the ability to cause something to happen that is large. Now, we have a word that comes from dunamis, and it's dynamite. And the reason is because when dynamite is sitting on the table, it has the potential to cause great change. The power of God is not like dynamite. Dynamite is like the power of God, which means when it says you are able, are you able? It says, he says, if you are willing, you have the ability to, what? Heal me. Not heal, but it's to make him what? Make him clean. Clean is a spiritual word. It is not a physical word. It has to do with, so what he's saying to Jesus is, I believe, he says, if you're willing, and that's like being kind or honoring. He's kneeling too. I'm not going to kneel because it'd take me too long to get back up. But he says, if you have what? Within you, resident within you, is the ability to bring about great change in my life. That's what power is. We think about, it's used all the time. The power and authority. The power and authority. They're always together, power and authority. And we need to think about them in this way because what power really means is that there's constantly the potential that something big might happen. But it may just be quiet for a while too because it's just resident in it. When we are given power and authority, that's something we need to think about. Because that means we become people who what? We have resident within us the potential to bring about great change. That's pretty cool. Anyway, that's what he says, and you can make me clean. This is absolutely, he's asking Jesus to not only change his skin, but to give him his life back. It's when you heal, when you make me clean, it's not just my skin, it is my being. In everything about this request, it just reeks with him wanting to not live under the shame of this disease, both physically and spiritually. Now, we don't work this way. We don't think this way. This is an interesting dilemma for me because I know full well that Jesus, as God, knew that the reason this person had leprosy had nothing to do with the fact that he'd slandered anybody. But it's interesting how continually through the Bible, and I don't mean to be, controversial here, but continually through the Bible, God will use mankind's misconceptions about the existential nature of the world, and he will use them and never correct them, but still work through them to bring about a greater truth. And he's doing it right here. He never goes, oh, dear friend, I'm just going to let you in on a secret. You don't need to worry about sin causing this, because that's not really true. The reason that you got this is, and he doesn't do that, and this happens all over in the Bible. God uses their misconceptions about the way the world works. But right now, what he's really trying to do, because that would be too much time for Jesus. He just needs to find a way to get this guy back home with his family. This make sense? Okay. Yeah. I often wonder, and some of you have heard me for decades talk about this, but I often wonder what it is that we believe is absolutely true about the world right now, and we would all stand up and go, that is the fact. And it's dead wrong, and God doesn't change our minds about it because he's using something in it to teach us a bigger truth. And there's something out there, I know there is, because there always is, because we don't know everything. But it's just interesting to me. And I know that I could write, that's a book I could write. All of the things that people in the Bible think are real that God never corrects. Because I've said this many times, Jesus could have come and rather than healing people, he could have said, hey, wash your hands. There's a thing called germs. They won't discover them until after the Civil War in America, which you haven't discovered yet. And then the people start washing their hands and you won't get all these problems. Brush your teeth. You see what I'm saying? But God never says that. He just works around it with their misconceptions about reality, because the bigger truth is who he is and about him. And we're going to find out right now who he is. So it goes on, it says, moved with compassion. Now, does your Bible have a note there that says, it goes, moved with compassion, and then down at the bottom it goes, some manuscripts read moved with anger. You have that? Yeah. Well, guess what? The texts are about evenly split. And I find it odd, because here's the deal. If Jesus was actually moved with anger, we got to figure out why. Why would he be, and I want to talk about that in a minute. If he's moved with anger, why is Jesus so mad all of a sudden? Well, there are reasons why he could have been, but they don't sound very Jesus-like. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I can see how somebody might go, whoa, this is some guy's copying the text, in the 3rd century. Moved with anger? That's not very Jesus-like. Let's change that to compassion. Then he gives it to the next guy who copies it and goes, Jesus, moved with compassion. And then the guy who was sitting next to him said, moved with anger. That's weird, but that's what it says. And so he writes, the next copy is moved with anger, and he passes it this way, and they pass it this way, and we end up with equal numbers of texts, and half of them say that Jesus was moved with anger, and half of them say he was moved with compassion. Now, the bottom line is, if it originally said moved with compassion, and somebody changed it to anger, he had an axe to grind. That's all I got to say, because there's no reason. Nobody changes a text to make it more complicated and difficult to understand. That's one of the rules of text criticism. You never edit anything to make it so that people can't figure out what you're talking about. You always go the other way. And so it makes perfect sense to me that it started out anger and somebody moved it to compassion. But I don't know. And scholars are split. Now let's think about, why would Jesus be moved to anger? Well, he could be moved to anger because a leper came up to him. And he's Jesus, for heaven's sakes. He doesn't want to be unclean. This guy comes out of nowhere. But you know what? Some scholars say that's the reason Jesus was angry about this, and I think that's ridiculous, because Jesus never shows any concern for keeping the law. When it comes time to do something that's important, he doesn't care what happens to him in the process of this in terms of the law. He wants to do the right thing. So I don't think he'd have been angry if this man came up to him. I don't think so. And other people say, well, later on it says that he threw him out. He's going to say he threw him out. The Greek is really clear. It's like he's throwing him out of a building. And they say, well, he must have been in the synagogue preaching. And this leper came in while he was preaching, and he cut him off mid-sermon. And nobody likes to be cut off mid-sermon. No, seriously, they say this. And that Jesus was just furious that he was on point 2 of 4, and this guy comes in and interrupts him, and he's a leper, no less. And so he looks at him and he's like, what are you doing? I'm preaching here. And so he's moved with anger, and that is one of the goofiest things I have ever heard. There is no clue in the scripture that Jesus cares about people interrupting him when he's talking to people. It's just so un-Jesus-like. There is a possibility, though, that when he saw this leprous man in front of him, which, by the way, would have been fairly rare for him to see a man this close who had leprosy, because lepers had to keep their distance, and Jesus was with a group of people all the time, and they didn't hang out around lepers. And so to see this man at the beginning of his ministry this close brought to Jesus' mind all of the terrible consequences of sin in the world. And here in front of him is a man who, by his very physical nature, or physical appearance, shows us how broken the world is. And Jesus knows all the rules, and he sees in front of him a man who His life has been ruined by all of the rules and the things that come with something that he's not brought on himself in any manner, and all of the shame that comes. I mean, we could just go on and on about all the things that Jesus could see wrapped up in one man right in front of him, and he knows that his mission is to bring healing to this kind of terribleness, and he knows that there are thousands and thousands of other people in Galilee and Palestine generally who all are suffering in the same way, and he is what? Angry. I can buy that one. Because if he's angry like that, then he's also compassionate, and they both work. Okay? Does this make sense? Now I know that was a lot to get to there. But for me, I don't struggle with an angry Jesus if that's why he's angry. We'll be able to ask him someday. We'll be able to ask him, and he'll clear that up, and he'll go, oh, they both got it wrong. It was just something like that. But this is it's a textual variant that actually makes a difference, unless you think about it very carefully. And most people just don't have the time to think about it. And there aren't a ton of these, but there are enough that I've said this many times. When we start getting into really strong Greek issues and contextual meanings and things, when we tend to end up with two things we can't tell what it is, usually they're both true in some manner if we just work really hard to figure them out. And this is one of them. So anyway, Jesus is what? Let's just leave it with compassion, because I think the NLT says compassion, does it not? Now, see, those guys made a decision. Well, there were ladies there too, but those people made a decision about this translation. But they had to put the thing at the bottom because they knew they didn't know what they're saying. So Jesus, what does he do? He does the impossible in that world. He reaches out and touches this man. Now, this is Jesus at his best. Jesus at his best. Why? Because he is risking uncleanliness. He is breaking the law. He is doing all sorts of things that religious people would say are compromises too far. And Jesus does it because why? Because his heart is moved. Because he knows what can happen if he reaches out his hand. Jesus does not have to reach out his hand to heal. We will see this. There are times when he just says, go home, your servant is well. But Jesus reaching out and touching him, nobody would have. Now let's just say, I don't know how long this man had been a leper, but he'd been unable to touch or be touched by anyone other than other lepers for as long as he'd been declared to have this disease by a priest. Untouched. And we have that word, untouchables. I was trying to think if there were anybody like this in our culture. And there was a period in the 80s, for those of you who are old enough to remember AIDS when it first came, but I mean we had a thing about when we didn't really understand AIDS that people became the lepers of our society. That's about as close as I can come in our world. And yet Jesus does the wonderful thing if he reaches out and he touches this man. The Greek is just two words. He says, the word is cool. It's like, I will. And when it says, I am willing, that first part, thelu, is like, I will. It's like a thing of his deeper will to do it. I just love that. I just love it. And he reaches out and he says, be healed. Now, the actual Greek language is the same kind of wording as when he cast the demon out of that guy earlier in the synagogue. This language is not the language of medical healing. It is the language of exorcism. Now we go, well, why would Jesus do that? Why would Jesus do that? Well, the truth is that in their minds, there is a deep connection between sin and illness and the devil's work and all of these. And so when he goes to healing people in that culture, he uses language that talks to where their minds are working. Like he is and it says that he is the leprosy is coming out of him, is essentially what the language is like. Now, that again, what we do not want to do is we don't want to jump to any assumptions about anything. He's speaking into their world when he does this, because everybody who sees this and is there needs to hear something that makes sense to them when he heals them. But that's really powerful. Oh, did you put that? And immediately departed from him the leprosy. There, yeah, it's exactly it. Because, see, it departs from him. It's not like he just, I don't even know what it looked like. But in their minds, something was, from inside of him was coming out. And suddenly I just had this great thought about that. And when we are fully healed spiritually by the blood of Christ on the cross, that is exactly what happens to us. Something in us comes out. Because something else, comes in. And it's all that language. Well, anyway, yeah. Instantly the leprosy, it came up, and the man was healed. And then it says, Jesus sent him on his way with a stern warning. This word warning, now that's where, literally it says he threw him out. And that's where everybody gets, well, he was preaching somewhere. He was in a synagogue somewhere, and he's in a building somewhere, and Jesus throws him out of a building. I don't know. There it is. But that last word where it said sternly, the word literally is a really, really long word. Because you see where it says kai embrymesemenos. You see that? Second line. Embrymesemenos, which is a word I will never be able to say, means to growl. Can you imagine if you're walking by your neighbor's dog and it's going, and you go, stop embrymenosing at me. But that's what the word means, to growl. The reason I think, I can't imagine Jesus went, like that. The sternness of his command to him, though, was such that Mark could only, or maybe Peter, because Peter was there and told Mark about this, but maybe the only thing that they could equate with the way that Jesus talked to this man right now, just after he'd healed him. Because remember, he's just healed him. The guy, and instead of like Jesus doesn't go, isn't this great? Or, the guy, there is no response from the leper in the moment. He's not a leper anymore. There's no response from the people in the moment. My thinking is he probably was in a building or the synagogue, and there weren't very many people there when this happened, because this is the way that it seems to be going here. And I think that the leper would have waited till a moment when he could get to him, when he didn't get everybody upset, just a few people upset. And so I think when he says that Jesus, sent him away with a stern warning, I think that probably Peter and Mark, when he wrote it down, couldn't think of a more growly, mad, stern word than this word. Because it doesn't show up anywhere. I mean, it's not a word it's not a biblical word very often. And I don't even know if do you know, Jeff, is it a hapex legomenon, as they say? Which means a word that's only used one time in the New Testament. Okay, anyway. But it's like a really odd word. Jesus growling. And what's he say? He goes, can you put up the next thing? And then he says, don't tell anybody about this. Now, I remember when I started, I think I talked a couple weeks ago about the thing about the book of Mark, constantly Jesus telling people not to say anything about it. Well, people have different ideas about why Jesus would say this. And the first one is that what he's actually going to do, and we'll talk about it in a moment, the details of it, but he wants this man to go to the priest. And by the way, by this time, so few people got healed of leprosy back by this time. And when the original rules were made about what you do if you got healed, they still had the tabernacle, and they were still traveling around in the wilderness, and the tabernacle was with them. But by the time we get here, if you got healed from leprosy, the tabernacle didn't exist anymore. The temple did in Jerusalem, and so you had to go to a priest in Jerusalem to get checked out. Now, this is a 3-day walk. If you're hurrying from Galilee to Jerusalem to get checked out. And so he says, don't tell anybody about this, because why? Because he wants this man to go to the official system and get declared. Priests do not cleanse anybody, they declare you clean. And when a priest declares somebody clean from leprosy, this would be like a national event. And so he's like, he wants him to go to Jerusalem and go through the processes because he's done something that is the same as raising somebody from the dead, and the word's going to travel, and he wants the whole religious system behind him that this man has done something that we are saying is from God. And so he says, don't talk about it. Just what? Go to the priest and let him examine you. Now that's a process, and let me tell you, you'd had to take a lot of stuff with you. You had to take 2 birds, 2 male sheep, 1 female sheep, a stick of cedar, some scarlet yarn, a branch of hyssop, 6 quarts of flowers, and a cup of olive oil with you to get everything taken care of. Now, I'm just saying. And this guy just got healed with, he gets healed with leprosy. He growls, don't talk about this. And get down to Jerusalem to the priest and take care of that. And the guy's thinking, I got to go buy 3 sheep and 2 doves and 6 quarts of flour. And he says, that's a 3-day walk, Jesus. I'm going to need a cart. You know, I don't think he was thinking that. But that's what Jesus wanted him to do. Because what? It says, he even says, take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. Once again, what just happened was equal to Jesus raising somebody from the dead in their mind. I can't emphasize that enough. And the reason those are connected is because a leper's life is the same as a dead person's life. And healing someone from leprosy is giving them their life back. And when you give someone their life back, you raise them from the dead. And that's what's happening here. And Jesus wants him to do the right thing because this is going to be big news. It's going to be big news. And he wants big news like this to line up with the religious system in enough of a way that people will not question where this power is coming from. If Jesus had healed him and said, don't you worry about those stupid rules in the book of Moses' book in Leviticus, don't you worry about that. You're free to go live your life. And every person who ever heard that story would have said, this man is against the law and he must be from the devil. So Jesus says this to them. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. When he says this will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed, who's the public testimony for? The priests. The priests. The general population couldn't have cared less about that stuff. The general population, particularly in Galilee, they didn't go to Jerusalem that often, maybe once a year if they were lucky. But most people couldn't afford to go down there that often. There is a system, if you read Leviticus, I would say sometime when you just don't have anything else to do and want to learn what to do if you get healed of leprosy, read chapter 14. It's 8 days of process, plus all these sacrifices and everything. And all the sacrifices are related to forgiveness of sin and thanksgiving for God's provision of the forgiveness of sin. So they're not thinking in their mind that there's any difference between what just happened and people getting their sins forgiven. This is powerful stuff. But Jesus wants this to all fit in the system because he doesn't want people to make assumptions that he's working with the devil. Because they're perfectly fine in their world. They're thinking if the devil gave him leprosy because he'd been slandering people and he's getting punished by God through the devil to get leprosy, why wouldn't the devil could rebel against God and take the leprosy away, couldn't he? I mean, that's the kind of logic they would use. And so he wants the priests on his side. Now, some people disagree with that. They would say, no. Jesus is like this thing about go see the people in Jerusalem is just a ruse on his part because He doesn't really care if this guy goes down there. In fact, saying this is going to remind the guy he's supposed to do that, and the guy's going to go, oh, no. And he says, don't tell anybody, and that's like a cue to him to tell everybody. To tell everybody. And that Jesus is just like working it because he wants to be more popular. He wants to get his name out there that he healed somebody of leprosy. I think it's crazy, but he's Jesus. He knew what was going to happen. I don't think, though, that what he needed to do, he wasn't marketing himself. He wasn't compassionate on this man because he knew, if I'm compassionate on this guy, he's a blabbermouth, and I'm gonna get so popular because of this, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. And some people talk like that about Jesus, but not me. Oh yeah, it says, but the man went and spread the word, proclaiming to everyone what had happened. As a result, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus, and he couldn't publicly enter a town anyway. He had to stay out in the secluded places, but people from everywhere kept coming to him. Of course, Jesus says to not tell anybody, and the man goes and tells everyone. He says, go see a priest and show him what had happened, and the man just goes out into the public square and tells everybody but the priest. In fact, he doesn't even seek out a local priest in the area, because there were local priests. Now, of course, you know that priests would only serve at the temple. They didn't serve anywhere in their hometowns. There wasn't really much for them to do except possibly to speak to people about the scripture, or to comfort people, or to do weddings and things like that. But they did not do their primary priestly duties because they were members of a particular family that in a rotation would go down to Jerusalem and serve in the temple. And so there would have been priests around, but priests, by the way, all had to have jobs. They all had to have a career. They weren't just priests. And so they had to have a career, and so they had to do their thing. But we don't even see that this guy goes find one of those people and talks to him. No, he went and spread it. Literally says to everyone. Now, Mark is known for his hyperbolic comments. It's always all of them, everyone, the whole town, this. He speaks that way, but I'm pretty sure that Mark is not the hyperbolic one. Peter is the hyperbolic one, and that he spoke this way about things because Peter was so excited about what he'd experienced that everything is just over the top, and rightly so. But Peter was around when this happened. He was already following Jesus, and it says he proclaimed to everyone what had happened. Well, now let's just back up for a minute. This part of the world, these villages and towns are small. We don't know exactly where he was because he said he was going out throughout all of Galilee because I need to spread the word. I need to preach the word in other places. Well, Capernaum was the most important city in that whole area, and it was a city of 1,500. Now, I'm just saying, if you have a city of 1,500 and you have a leper in town, everybody knows who he is. Everybody would have known who he is because most people never traveled more than 10 miles away from their home in any direction at any time in their life in the first century. And so he would have grown up somewhere nearby there, had been found out to have leprosy. He would have been sequestered away. Oh, by the way, lepers could attend synagogue services, but they had a special compartment in the building that they walled away that lepers could go in there and listen over from behind partitions and stuff. But they couldn't touch anybody or anything other than in that space. So it is probably true that everyone knew what had happened. This kind of news travels quickly because, like I said at the beginning, healing someone of leprosy was like raising them from the dead. And this is as a result, or in turn, large crowds soon surrounded Jesus. No doubt. No doubt. Now, this is not because they were enthralled by Jesus' teaching. Let's never forget that the crowds are coming because a man who is a healer with proof that he can do this has come. Healers were not unusual. People who claimed to be able to heal people were common, but they generally failed. Most people, and particularly people with leprosy, were not healed by these healers. But if a man that everybody knows in the community, because actually leprosy is a community problem. We don't know how many lepers there were in the area. We don't know. But I'm sure that this one was known, and when well, just think about it. If you knew somebody that had a disease like this, and one day you see them and they have it, and the next day they look wondrous, completely healed, and everything about them is completely different, you're going to sit up and take notice. And so this is a very public event. This is why Jesus said, don't tell anybody. Go down and take care of the business first, and then come back in 2 weeks and show everybody. But oh no, as a result, what? Crowds, large crowds. This is essentially what it says now. Again, any time in the New Testament, in the Gospels, when you read about a crowd, it is a fickle thing. The crowds are always capable of turning on Jesus at any time. They are never something that we are to trust. A large crowd sounds good, but it may not be. This is going to be the same group of people that turn on Jesus in just a couple of chapters. And he's going to have huge crowds when he goes to Jerusalem on the week right before he gets crucified. And it's the same crowd that turns on him later. Always remember that the crowd is a symbol of a large gathering of people who are being moved by something right now, and their emotion is completely questionable. So large crowds soon surround him. Why? Because they want him to heal them. They want something from him. I think Jesus really didn't want this. He came to preach. The healing was a sign that you should listen to his preaching. The preaching was not an aside to the fact that he could heal. This said, it says that soon he could not enter a town anywhere. Think about that. The crowd around him was so much that when he tried to get into a city, probably means that the people that were still in the city were coming out, and there were people around him, and it all got messy, and so he had to do what? He had to stay out in secluded places. It's the same word about as to where he went when he was tempted by the devil. He is back out in the wilderness, if you will, places like that, because he can't go anywhere. Now, I have no idea what that would be like. But remember, Jesus has gone from, we're still in the first chapter, and he has gone from somebody who is anonymous, who gets baptized by John, and he's essentially anonymous, and now he can't go anywhere because the crowds are so massive. He is out in the country, out in the wilderness as it is. Now, he was there before. Now, it's an interesting twist here. It says he has to stay out in secluded places, but he's not secluded when he's out there. It says, but people from everywhere kept coming to him. Now, everywhere is, again, a hyperbolic statement. I'm sure it was mostly from Galilee. But what did Jesus say to the disciples? He said, we need to leave here, because he was out praying, and he goes out, and they find him early in the morning, and they find him, and they say, well, everybody's looking for you, Jesus. And he doesn't answer that. He says, we need to go where? To other towns in Galilee to preach the good news. Well, his mission has not changed. It's just now he's not going anywhere, and all of Galilee is coming to him. He is now able to speak to all of Galilee at the same time because they're all with him in the secluded places. People from everywhere kept coming to him. So this is where Jesus is. He didn't ask for this, but also I'm confident that what's happening is that what God sent Jesus to do, which was to give people a vision of what God wanted for his world, was happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere. I think I had some fairly Let's see. Gosh. I said, from this point onward, Jesus will be seen as either, and this is important. I know what I was going to say at the end of this chapter. From this point onward, we're going to see Jesus as, he's going to be seen as one of two things. He is either going to be seen as the bringer of the light of God, the goodness of God into the world. And some will see him as the Messiah. And he will have people that see him as someone who is directly from heaven. And from now on, there's always going to be this aspect that he was trying to avoid with sending the leper man down to Jerusalem. People are going to see him as an agent of the devil. And they're going to see him in two ways, and we're going to now, because starting in the next thing that we talk about, we're going to begin to get these two divisions. And since the crowd is fickle, and this is an important point, in the end, they're going to all end up over here. They're all going to end up over here. Why? Because when they start to listen to Jesus teach, he's going to make demands on their lives they're unwilling to give to him. They will take his healing. They will take his good things that he can give to them, but they will not take his demand of discipleship. Okay? And so that's where, okay, now let's see. It is 9, is 12, is it 8:12? It's early, but I'm about to start chapter 2. Now remember, I'll just sort of set it up, okay? And then you'll be all ready for next week. There is no such thing as chapter 2 in the original. They just bump right up against each other. Can you put the first verses of chapter 2 up for me? Yeah. And now, essentially this is what it says. When he returned to Capernaum, he's going to go home. A lot of people say that he only got to go home because he snuck home. Because if he did come in and they'd have known he was coming, the whole town would have come out, because we've already had stuff happen in Capernaum where the crowd's all over him. But it says, and I have to say, can I just say this? I am also teaching Luke to the high school kids right now. And so if I start to say things that come out of Luke, can you raise me and say, Tim, you're in the wrong book? Because it's hard to keep, we're starting in the same place. It's hard to keep the books. But this is immediately up against it. Jesus can't, so we have to remember, there's just a few days go by. And it's interesting in the Greek, it doesn't tell us whether it's like a week or 3 days or what, but we just know that a few days later, he's been out in the, we don't even know how long he'd been out, having to be out in the wilderness, but after a while he goes, I got to go home. And some people say, well, he wanted to go home because he needed a break. He needed to rest because he needed to go to his house there, or Peter's house, just to settle down, sneak in and go in there. And it actually says right there, when he went home, the news spread quickly that he was back home. Well, of course the news spread quickly that he was back home, because they all know that he did what? He cast a demon out of somebody at one time, and then while he was out in a few other places, he healed somebody of leprosy, and who knows what happened out in the wilderness when people were coming out to him. Mark doesn't tell us. He's not told us one thing that Jesus has preached. But that's what's happening here. And so he's back home. And so what is about to happen is, and then we'll stop with this because this will be a good place, because this is a really great story. And I think I have 26, I don't know, pages of notes. But what's going to happen here is that people are going to be amazed, but there are also going to be people who have a lot at stake if Jesus is right. Okay? And Jesus is going to do he's already done a couple of things that are not cool by the virtue of the scribes and the Pharisees and all those people. And so slowly, Mark is going to bring these people into the story, because someday that thing is going to steamroll, and we're going to have, because Jesus is really on a trip to where? This whole story is what this actually, the book of Mark really is. The book of Mark is a story about the crucifixion and death and resurrection of Jesus with a really long beginning. Because without that ending, this whole thing isn't worth it. I mean, he's just a great guy who happened to have some special powers. But that's not what it's about. So that's what's going to happen. If I start talking, we'll be here till the end. I don't want to do that because we won't be able to finish. It's just too much stuff. But here's the deal. Let me finish with saying this. In what we have just read and talked about, we have seen the heart of God. I fully believe that Jesus was angry when he looked at that man. But his anger was built on his compassion. Jesus has come to do what? To right the brokenness of the world that comes from sin. We are the reason there is sin in the world. But we are also so valuable and so important to God and to his Son that they're willing to go through all of this that we're talking about in order to bring us back into a relationship with God so that we can put all of this stuff that's broken and all the things behind us eventually. And even in this world, be, as I said last week, a light of the hope of the future in the present. This is what's happening here. This is powerful stuff. And the more that we think about God's heart and Jesus' expression of it, I think the less anxious we'll be about life. I think the less anxious we'll be about it.